If you are from the United States, it's likely that you are taught that there are 7 continents on this Earth, but other parts of the world teach a 6 continent model, either combining Europe and Asia into Eurasia or North and South America into simply America. It might surprise you to find out that the 5 rings of the Olympic flag represent a 6 continent model. Those 5 rings represent the 5 inhabited continents, but deliberately exclude Antarctica. And setting aside the fact that geographers still disagree over how many continents there are, the term itself has ancient origins that have long impacted world politics and science and education. And the modern understanding of the term has only coalesced in the surprisingly recent era. The continents themselves might be very old, but the human understanding and definition of them is, well, history that deserves to be remembered. The term continent and its original social and scientific definition had a lot to do with the part of the world where those ideas were first formulated. It was the ancient Greeks who would have the greatest influence on the modern conception of continents. The term itself comes from a Greek word meaning landmass or terra firma. It was originally the proper name for the region in the northwest of Greece, the land of Epirus. Early Greek mariners sailing the Aegean saw their civilization and their trade as the center of the world. They essentially divided the world into 2 parts, Europe and Asia, separated by waterways. From the Aegean Sea north through the Dardanelles, the Sea of Marmara, the Bosporus, the Black Sea, and north into the Sea of Azov. It was slightly later that the Greeks added a third piece of the world to that conception, that of Libya, which we now know as Africa. The Greeks sat in a unique position in this conception, and in fact it was not perfectly clear if they existed within the scheme at all. Some Greeks didn't identify themselves as Europeans at all, instead using that term to refer to non-Greek states like Thracia. Another conception suggested that mainland Greece was part of Europe, but not the islands or the Peloponnesus. Aristotle went further, claiming that the Greeks existed outside of the continental concept altogether, and that they represented a middle position. These initial conceptions were limited, at least partially, by how little the Greeks knew about the inland parts of most of these regions. And their use of the term continent generally only referred to the regions near the shore. And if anyone thinks that our arguments over whether Europe should be regarded as its own continent is a modern disagreement, Herodotus criticized the idea in the 5th century BC, writing that the boundaries of Europe are quite unknown, and that for my part I cannot conceive why 3 names should ever have been given to a tract, which in reality is one, referring to Europe, Asia, and Libya. Later, the geographer Strabo was also critical of the scheme and wrote that in giving names to the 3 continents, the Greeks did not take into consideration the whole habitable earth, but merely their own country and the land exactly opposite. The true extents of these continents were unknown, and in fact the Greeks never understood them quite like we do today. As knowledge expanded, so did the size of the continents. Exact boundaries were also shifting. The boundary between Europe and Asia was never firmly agreed upon and was alternatively viewed as following from the Black Sea along the Rioni River that flows through Georgia, as was preferred by Herodotus, or along the Don River to the north, as preferred by geographer Strabo. Similarly, the boundary between Africa and Asia was uncertain, usually set at the Nile River. Herodotus thought it was ridiculous to divide the country between continents, and instead suggested that the continental boundary should sit on the western boundary of Egypt. The Romans continued to use the scheme in an informal way and had provinces called Asia in modern Turkey and Africa along the coast of that continent. Europe as a concept held more meaning, exemplified in Pliny describing Europe as the nursling of the people that conquered all the nations and by far the most beautiful of lands. Geographical maps like that of Claudius Ptolemy invented the antecedents to modern latitude and longitude lines. His contention that Africa and Asia were linked by a land enclosing the Indian Ocean would continue to appear on maps for centuries afterwards. The fall of the empire would not bring down the 3-continent scheme, which, especially in Europe, took on greater scholarly importance. The Middle Ages saw Europe work to find the continents within the Bible, which doesn't mention them at length, if at all. St. Jerome, who translated the Vulgate Bible, would write that Noah gave each of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, one of the 3 parts of the world for their inheritance, and these were Asia, Africa, and Europe, respectively. This was important because it gave this conception of continents a religious significance, and additionally allowed contemporaries to explain why Asia was larger than the other 2 continents. Shem was the eldest son. Medieval Muslim cartographers did not make such distinctions. This led to the most common form of medieval European maps, T&O maps. first described in the 7th century by Isidore of Seville, who wrote that the earth may be divided into 3 sides. Europe is divided from Africa by the sea, and Asia is divided from Libya with Egypt by the Nile. In medieval cartography, the T was understood to be the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, and the Don River, and the O represented the encircling ocean. Reflecting the religious nature of these maps, Jerusalem was usually depicted at its center, with east depicted on the upper portion where modern maps place north, and Eden placed at the top of the map, nearest to heaven. These maps are often difficult to parse, owing in part to the period's profoundly theological view of space. They were not especially useful for actually finding one's way. Unlike some Greek geographers, the Middle Ages generally saw it as a gospel that the Nile separated Africa from Asia. Renaissance and medieval writers turned to the ancients as authorities, with 16th century geographer Sebastian Münster writing of the ancient division of the Old World into 3 regions separated by the Don, Mediterranean, and the Nile. It wasn't irrelevant either that Christendom seemed to fit neatly into the Greek conception of Europe. Increasing secularism and humanism additionally led cultures in that Christendom to seek a secular identity, and the 15th century saw Christians of the former Western Roman Empire begin to identify as Europeans. It isn't surprising that these increasingly foundational conceptions of the continents faced significant disruption on the discovery of the Americas. It would take time for European authors to even address the issue, with a popular 1555 French geographical text omitting any mention of the Americas at all. Professor Walter Mignolo argues that the Spanish denied the Americans continental status even longer. The Castilian notion of the Indies remained in place up to the end of the colonial empire. America began to be employed only toward the end of the 18th century. This was despite the fact that the Universalis Cosmographia in 1507 showed America separate from Asia. The Cosmographia is also the first to apply the name America to that land. Amerigo Vespucci wrote in 1502 or 1503 that I have discovered a continent in those southern regions. It wasn't until the 17th century that virtually all global geographies acknowledged the Americas as one of the 4 quarters or 4 corners of the world: America in the west, Asia in the east, Europe in the north, and Africa in the south. The first modern atlas, the Theatre of the World, appeared in 1570. The author, Abraham Ortelius, was the first person known to suggest that the continents had once been connected before drifting apart. Greater accuracy and new ideas led to a reconsideration of what actually constituted a continent. It was only in the early modern period that the modern separation of Africa and Asia at the Suez Isthmus came to dominate. This also began the ongoing issue of separating Asia and Europe. The Don River clearly didn't reach anywhere close to the Arctic region. Some scholars extended the division along other rivers like the Volga, but it was the 18th century that saw Swedish military officer Philipp Johann von Stahlenberg argue that the Ural Mountains were the logical barrier, a theory reinforced by the Russians, who were ideologically attempting to tie themselves to Europe and not Asia. The separation of Siberia was again a key part of the ideological puzzle, allowing what the Russians began calling the Great Tartary of the eastern land to be suitable for colonial rule. Argument remained, but by the 19th century the Ural boundary became the standard interpretation, although issues remained because the mountains did not form a complete boundary, forcing some maps to combine the boundary with pieces of the Volga or Don River, or by arbitrarily drawing a line from the end of the Urals to take a turn at the Caucasus Mountains. Issues of continental definitions continued using other criteria as well. English geographer and politician Hartford Mackinder extended Europe to the Sahara on a racial basis, as in his words, "It is the desert land that divides the black man from the white." The 1963 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica refers to the region of Pakistan as a region bordering on Europe and Asia, which would place all of Afghanistan within Europe. The previous uses of continent, however, ignored that those audiences had a very different conception of the world than a modern audience. In 1599, one writer called the West Indies, the islands of the Caribbean, a large and fruitful continent. Definitions of continent formed slowly. The English word is derived from the term continent land, Latin terra continens, but wasn't understood in the modern sense, instead referring only to a connected or continuous tract of land, and was applied to areas much smaller than modern readers would expect. In the 16th century, writers spoke of the continents of the Isle of Man, Ireland, and Wales, and even Sumatra. In the mid-17th century, one geographical writer wrote that a continent is a great quantity of land, not separated by any sea from the rest of the world. In 1727, the Cyclopedia of Ephraim Chambers wrote that the world is ordinarily divided into two grand continents, the Old and the New. In 1752, cartographer Emmanuel Bowen defined continent as a large space of dry land comprehending many countries all joined together without any separation by water. Thus, Europe, Asia, and Africa is one great continent, as America is another. Many geographers worried about the conception of the three old world continents. In 1680, the English Atlas complained that the division seems not so rational, while many others argued that Europe was only an extension of Asia. By the end of the 1800s, however, the Oxford English Dictionary recounted that formerly two continents were reckoned, the Old and the New. Now it is usual to reckon 4 or 5, including North and South America. Australia gets only a brief mention as sometimes reckoned as another. Writers of the increasingly modern period divided the continents on more than physical barriers, with 19th century writer Carl Ritter claiming that each continent was so planned and formed as to have its own special function in the progress of human culture, and to claim each continent had its own race. These writers found reasons to argue for an empirical separation of the continents. Australia posed its own issues. Discovered in 1606, 18th and 19th century atlases disagreed about whether it was a part of Asia or its own continent. In the 18th century, the conception of an Oceania was posted, including not just Australia and minor Pacific islands, but also Polynesia and the Philippines. In The Myth of Continents, the authors write that it was only in the 1950s that Australia began to be firmly described as a continent, and it was World War II that forged the consensus that Indonesia and other islands nearby should be considered Asian. Similarly, before World War II, it was common for American atlases to consider the Americas as a single continent, and only after 1950 did it become common for American atlases to separate North and South America. As early as 1849, an atlas labeled Antarctica as a continent, but the Myth of Continents authors found that distinction was rare until after World War II. Despite the fact that many of these concepts appear to have a Eurocentric bias, they were applied largely uncritically in other parts of the world. Japan accepted the fourfold continent division in the 1700s. Cartographers in the Islamic world of the Middle Ages generally accepted continents as they found them defined in earlier Greek texts. That isn't to say that other regions didn't have their own forms of centrism. Maps made in India tended to have Central Asia as their center, and at least one labeled a far-off marginal section as England, France, and other hat-wearing islands. Of course, it was colonization that spread the European conception of continents furthest. Other reasons to embrace the scheme have come directly from resistance to Europe, which helped Japanese leaders identify with an Asian identity in the 19th century. Perhaps similarly, Latin American countries usually teach of a single American continent that Latin culture spans. It's valuable to remember that the scientific notion of plate tectonics, often used to argue for particular continental schemes, wasn't conceptualized until well after social definitions of the continents were. Alfred Wegener first suggested his conception of continental drift only in 1912, and the theory received significant resistance and argument between drifters and fixists. Plate tectonics wasn't fully described and generally accepted until the 1960s. The geological and scientific concept of the number of continents can and should be left up to experts in the field, but it's clear that the definition of continent was first and foremost a social definition that until very recently didn't even consider a scientific viewpoint. Even scientific definition, however, struggles to use the term without contradiction, with plates, cratons, and other concepts failing to simplify the matter. While much of the world's education now conforms to the system of 7 continents, others still teach 6, and some even argue for as few as 4 continents. Perhaps the most important lesson that we can learn from the history of trying to define the continents is that humans have constantly tried to define the space around us, but no matter what method we've used, the round peg of reality has refused to fit comfortably into the square hole of human convention. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.